Hello and welcome to another instance of Open World Chat. I'm John Odom. My co-host is Leanne Allen. And this time around, we're talking to Jim Dandy / Jim Dandeneau of Den of Geek. And boy, there's a lot we could cover with Jim, and we probably will in the future. This time around, we're focusing on the phenomenon of cinematic universes. Which ones work, which ones land on their faces, and why. A little after there, we go into a conversation about the political nature of superheroes. So we have a lot of fun. Here's Jim. Hey, so looking at you, I'm like, this is a verse guy. You know, I was, reading your stuff. You like the Arrowverse. You're an Arrowverse guy. You're also covering the MCU. And then there's the Snyderverse. There's all the verses out there. And, I wonder where they're going and which one is going to implode. And
I mean, the Snyderverse is already effectively dead. Well, right?
Well,
they're not
true.
making. They can talk about making more stuff in that, but the hassle that they went through to accomplish it and the returns on it don't seem like they match up well.
Where did it go wrong? Give me your diagnosis. Give me your postmortem.
From a business sense or from a creative sense?
Both.
Yeah,
both. I guess those are pretty distinct, aren't they? Creative and business never really cross over, do they?
They could have let him do what he wanted, and they would have still made $1 billion on the original Justice League. And quite honestly, if they had cut the Zack Snyder cut of the Justice League that showed up on HBO Max, if they had cut a half hour, 45 minutes out of that movie and released it into theaters, that movie would have made $1 billion, and it would have had the crap kicked out of it by critics, but it would have been fine. And then they could have let it just kind of fade away and pivoted off of that into phase 2 of the DC cinematic universe, and nobody would have batted an eye. But, instead they played the games that they did with it. They put people in charge of it who had no business being in charge of it and kept screwing everything up to the point where their solution after they botched the HBO Max rollout was to shovel more money at a guy who had been playing footsie with a hate group to finish the job. And so business wise, it's just been kind of a parade of errors from day one. Creatively, Zack Snyder and I don't like the same things. So I don't there were pieces of Justice League, his version of Justice League that I liked a lot. I liked the Wonder Woman stuff with Alfred in the cave. His Aquaman was okay. The stuff with the lady sniffing his sweater and singing was really super weird.
Yes.
But once I accepted and moved past the fact that this was a Batman who had recently killed wantonly, Affleck's Batman wasn't terrible. But the second Superman shows up, everything he does just grinds to a halt because he's so wrapped up in trying to make sure that we know that he is trying to make Superman a metaphor for something else. Then it's terrible.
Yeah.
Yep.
The Jesus, the constant "I'm crucified on the cross" thing. It's like, okay, we get it.
I get it. I understand the point you're trying to make. I don't need 15 minutes worth of slow-mo to hammer that point home.
Yes, please put the sledgehammer away.
So, Birds of Prey I thought was great, and I think that both movie universes are moving in a direction where you're going to start to get a little bit more freedom to have some vision, some distinct visions for creative types. I think WandaVision was really interesting. It didn't always work, and the closer they got to the superhero stuff, the less it worked. But as a story about processing trauma and grief, I thought it was pretty good. Cap and Falcon and Winter Soldier, there were parts of it that were really powerful for some folks. There were some parts of it that were really, really super on the nose. I actually like comics US Agent better.
Well, yeah. I can see that.
He's dealt with more honestly. Mm-hmm. I think that by the end of Falcon and Winter Soldier, U.S. Agent they need him to be a superhero for something that's coming later. So they just make him a superhero. There's no real effort or attempt at redemption. At a redemption arc, they just tell us that he's redeemed.
Oh, you think so? I did not necessarily feel that. I felt like his redemption was still an open question, which I actually found kind of interesting. I mean, the heart and soul of that whole series really seemed to be about the relationship between the two primary characters and the discussion on race through.
Yeah.
Just, has anybody seen it? Should I worry about giving anything away? Anyways,
it's a cultural juggernaut. I mean, we used to talk about the death of the monoculture before because like the internet fractured all of fandoms into, it atomized all of the different fandoms into their own unique little pieces. But I think that the pandemic kind of accelerated the reassembling of the monoculture in that like everybody's an MCU person now. Everybody cares about, and that's the thing about these universes is that these universes are kind of the reassembling of the monoculture where, we now have broad shared cultural experiences. It's just around mostly mediocre superhero media.
So, you've got you're talking about the Snyderverse, which is no longer the Snyderverse. It's the DC verse. And they've got these things that are growing out of it that are very nice. And honestly, I think that probably worked out the best for it because there was diminishing returns on Snyder proper, his stuff. Mm-hmm. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is everywhere. They both get their own, people say Marvel Cinematic Universe is too silly, Snyderverse is too dark. Then there's the Arrowverse, which I feel like people say is too, I don't want to say parochial, but they've got their one little style. They've got their crowd. They write all their stuff for their crowd. They don't seem to be all that interested in expanding their crowd. So it's like this little circle who just sort of have fun together and make their shows. And it's like, it's a bubble, nobody else is getting into it. So
yes, it's a niche,
but it's also, it's the most popular stuff that the CW has ever done, right? Like the ratings. You watch Legends of Tomorrow, the first season, and tell me in the middle of that show's going to get 6 seasons. I don't know how the hell that happened, right? But honestly, the same thing goes for Arrow. Like Arrow, they're doing enough to stay on the air. And by doing that, they start to kind of piece together the ability to become broader cultural experiences. So, instead of just Arrow and, a niche group of fans getting excited about Merlin coming back to life, you have Earth X showing up, right? You have the crossover with Supergirl that happens, the Flash and Supergirl annual crossover. That's every season, the best episode of either show, or you get Legends of Tomorrow doing Sailor Moon with a Tickle Me Elmo. But then you get the ability to do that stuff, and that's where the staying power comes from.
Yeah.
Is the fact that the last Arrow was a slog for probably the back half of the show until the last season, and then the last season started examining kind of what Oliver meant to the Arrowverse itself, and it got interesting again. It stopped being "you have failed the city" and started being, look at what you've done, look at what you've accomplished, look at what this has enabled us to do. So Flash was interesting at the start. It got kind of boring and sloggy in the middle, and then they turned Barry into Wally West, and it started being good again. Supergirl has always been a little bit more explicitly political, but it's also, Melissa Benoist is delightful, and she has a personality that has kind of impacted how Kara shows up in the comics too. So it's not, Arrowverse is not the same thing as the Snyderverse. It's not the same thing as the DC cinematic multiverse or the MCU. And it's definitely niche. It's definitely written for people who have been watching the CW shows since their start. Mm-hmm. But they're in that, they are the most comic booky things out there. They are the most comic booky media because comic books themselves are super insular. Like you can't jump into X-Men comics right now without looking up a Wikipedia entry.
Oh my God.
And they reset 2 years ago, right? The whole X-Men line reset 2 years ago. So you can't tell me that having to go figure out exactly who Heatwave is and how he has progressed from his first appearances on The Flash to Legends of Tomorrow, where they turned him into 80s Pyro.
And Obama versus Grodd. I mean, where else do you get Obama versus Grodd? That's very cool.
It's bonkers. It's bonkers. It like, to me, that show feels like they spend a lot of their budget on weed for the writers. And say, just write stuff down, and when we all sober up, we'll figure out how to make it work. So you get the Disney Princess episode that's coming this year. You get the beer pong episode from last season where they had to play beer pong against the demon. What were the other crazy ones? I mean, the bad one last week was a 50s horror movie where everyone was eating Thousand Island dressing that dripped off of an alien cocoon. It was really gross. It was really gross.
Okay, I did not see that.
Did not see that.
Okay. I will seek it out. You know.
Yeah, you can skip it. It's really bad. Super gross.
How can you say that and then tell me to skip it? You know?
Right.
It's fair. You're gonna want to experience that firsthand. But that's how you get a Tickle Me Elmo being the big MacGuffin of a season, right? Is the writers get really, really high.
I can, that makes so much sense. But a question I have that I've just kind of been noodling around while you've been talking, with shows or series like the Arrowverse series, they always do seem to kind of start off really slow, and you kind of wonder why anybody's watching. And I sort of wonder how much of that is, and you touched on this a little bit, is because they have the connection to things that already exist within that network. So people who are fans of those other things are kind of willing to play along for a while until the show picks up. What do you think about that?
I think you've got a point there. I do think that a good chunk of this audience is watching for the connections, and then that gives them, or at least at some point started watching for the connections, and that gives the cast and crew a little bit more flexibility to take their time with the story. I do think that a lot of them deliberately play with that. I think that the MCU shows absolutely play with that intentionally. We'll tease stuff that goes nowhere because they know that the tease itself is keeping the audience engaged.
Yeah.
Quicksilver.
Quicksilver, is it, every single episode of WandaVision, is this how they bring the mutants in? Yeah. Right? But the DC shows, I think, have gotten away from that somewhat. I think that the CW shows have existed long enough where they've been able to develop their own identities and develop their own audiences. So they don't have to tease like that anymore, right? Perfect example. The first episode of Legends this season is Sarah Lance gets kidnapped by aliens at the end of the last season. And the first episode is them figuring out what's going on. They are they're investigating her disappearance in 1977 because the last place that they were at was at a British punk show in the 70s. And somebody says, "Oh, Nate is off hanging out with Starman." And my brain goes, is that Michael Thomas? Is it the blue skin one from the comics? No, it was Bowie. It was David Bowie. It was the actual Starman, not the Starman from the comics. And they knew they were doing that. They knew for a fact that they were doing that because they knew that their audience would not go to Bowie. They knew that their audience would go to Jack Knight, right?
Right.
So are they going to go on forever? I mean, we talk about the DC universe, the MCU. We think about the peaks and the troughs, and when are they going to run out? When are people getting sick of it? The CW stuff just seems like it could just kind of go on forever, and it's got this viable core of fans, and why stop?
Yeah, people are starting to walk away though, right? Supergirl's ending this season. Black Lightning's over after this season, I think. Arrow already ended. Flash is probably much closer to done than it is to starting, but they're replacing some of it. You see people walking away from Legends fairly regularly, right? Like they forced out Brandon Rouse last year. But Dominic Purcell, I think, is walking away too. Katie Lotz has been showing up less and less on screen lately, and actually directing more. So I think that these shows do have a lifespan. I just think that the CW shows especially have lived much longer than anybody ever expected them to.
But you don't think there could be just another round of replacements teed up and they're off to the races again? You think this thing that's looking winding down really is winding down?
I don't know that DC. Well, you've also got Stargirl, right? I don't know that DC. I don't know that Warner and AT&T have a cohesive plan in place for their various media properties the way that Marvel does. So I can't tell you that they're winding these down with a plan to replace them, because I just don't think that they have a game plan written out. I do think that the vacuum of comic book media will fill itself back in. Mm-hmm. I think that if Legends decides to shut it down after next season, and if the Flash starts to go away, I don't think that the CW has replacements that they can trust, that don't come with a built-in audience the way that the DC shows do.
The Arrowverse sort of grounded the whole DC media picture so much. It's a shame if it's drifting.
I think the multiverse stuff that they're doing is the best way to embrace what the comics are. I really like the Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover.
It was
on
fun.
The shows.
Yeah.
It was very spiritually faithful to the source material. And I think that at least on the comics side, the decision makers are calling shots to embrace that. I don't know if they've been able to completely sell the other media components of the conglomerate on it. But like the stuff that came out of Fandom last year kind of made me think that they had. And the fact that, I mean, sure, yes, they're chasing the Spider-Man stuff with this, but the fact that they're going to pack every Batman into the Flash next year, it does have me kind of believing that at least they're going to dabble with it. And if that turns out to be successful, then we may get a full-blown cinematic multiverse.
Well, that would be cool. I love that stuff.
Hell yeah.
I never get sick of that.
Hell yeah, because you know what that means is at some point we're going to get a movie version of Multiversity, which is going to be just beautiful.
That would be wild.
If we're talking about verses, there are other verses that are happening. I'm thinking Monsterverse. Is Monsterverse 2.0 going to be a thing?
Yes, but only because that's the direction everything is headed in, right? Like the shared universes, the way that the shared universes work in comics. And one of the reasons why I think that they're so enriching to comic storytelling is their storytelling shorthand, right? You don't need to add or be as conscientious about adding details in to the universe to make it feel rich and lived in when you can have Superman fly by in the background, because Superman flying by in the background implies a whole bunch of stuff about what else is going on that automatically fills out that universe in the viewer or the reader's head. So you're absolutely going to get Monsterverse 2.0 because of how easily that makes that universe feel rich and lived in. And because there's enough money in it that it just makes a ton of sense to do it. You know, you get people like with the TV shows, you get people watching these CW Arrowverse shows, at least initially, so that they can catch all of the Easter eggs in it and that they can find the references to their favorite comics. You know, you'll get people watching these, you know, the King Kong and the Godzilla and the Ghidorah movies just for callbacks to the Toho versions, right? And that'll string them along long enough where they'll eventually get invested in the current universe.
So you think the studios have got the formula on this? Because I'm thinking back to the other Monsterverse, right? Universal Monsterverse, which crashed and burned. Why did that crash and burn so badly?
Well, I can and can't tell you because I didn't watch any of them. And the fact that I didn't watch any of them, I think, is the reason why it didn't work.
Thank you.
You know, at least with the King Kong and the Godzilla movies, the current batch of them. I've watched a few of those, but those old, and I quite honestly, like I watched King of the Monsters because King Kong versus Godzilla was coming out, and I wanted to feel like I was prepped for it. And it was a dreadful movie.
Oh, yeah.
It was really stupid. It was great when the monsters were punching each other, but anytime a human being opened their mouth, it was dumb as hell.
Terrible.
Right? But they got me to watch it, and that's why this one is going to be successful, because they can capture the cultural zeitgeist more. They can capture the cultural zeitgeist effectively in a world where the existence of these other shared universes has primed people to get excited for shared universes on principle. Mm-hmm. That hadn't, and actually I think maybe that's part of it. That hadn't happened yet when the original Monsterverse tried to get off the ground. So people just kind of rolled their eyes and said, okay, you're just doing Marvel Comics.
Yeah, doing Marvel Comics, but I did see them, and
they're bad, right?
Yeah, they really were.
Were the Godzilla King of the Monsters bad, or were they just regular bad?
Boy, that's a tough question. You know, I actually think they were worse bad than Godzilla King of the Monsters. They seemed like such product, for one thing. I mean, Godzilla King of the Monsters, at least there was a lot of love in the fight scenes, even if they were all in overcast days. And I started thinking, God, somebody, at least shine a spotlight. But there was some love in there. There was no love in the Tom Cruise Mummy. It was just, let's sprint through this. Let's establish him as some ongoing hero. Let's get Russell Crowe in there to be Dr. Jekyll and, turn into a sort of a League of Extraordinary Gentlemen style Mr. Hyde for no apparent reason. It was awful. It was dumb. And all of that came at the expense of any interest in any kind of story, such as it was.
It really, really felt like it was the financial folks who were driving those instead of the people who, really cared about what they were writing.
Yep.
Yeah. It did not feel like those movies were works of, that came out of someone's heart. Those felt like movies that were like, oh, well, we're going to do a movie, but the producers say we have to have this and we have to have that and we have to have these names or names as good as these, and that kind of broke everything.
So it was like if the MCU had started with Iron Man 2.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but while we're talking, I'm thinking that it had the big disadvantage of not having that kind of core base you were talking about. The Godzilla movies, harkening back to the old Godzilla movies. I mean, the Universal Monsterverse was not harkening back to Boris Karloff. There was no nostalgia. It was just a thing. And so that was probably part of its doom.
Well, and I think nostalgia might be selling it short a little bit, because like it sounds like to me, the Universal Monsterverse was empty nostalgia. Was, hey, remember this thing for the sake of remembering it and not remember it because you loved it. The Godzilla King of the Monsters definitely loved those old Japanese Godzilla movies. And definitely they were like, what if we did the same thing, only instead of guys in suits, we can have the computer handle it for us. And they meant well with that. The MCU, the best MCU movies really love the source material, right? Captain America First Avenger worked so well because they had the Rocketeer guy making a sequel to the Rocketeer, but also because they loved the Captain America story, right? Winter Soldier worked so well because the Russo brothers really loved that Winter Soldier story. Infinity War and whatever Endgame. never remember the damn
quickly they forget.
I know. I remember Captain America picking up the hammer, and that's all that mattered. Infinity War and Endgame felt like those Infinity crossovers from the 80s, right? They felt like the old Infinity Gauntlet book. So if you don't have that genuine affection for the source material, then all you're going to get is soulless box ticking, right?
Yeah.
And that it sounds like that's what happened with the Universal movies.
Oh, yeah. Yep, definitely.
It certainly felt that way.
Oh, God. Are there any other verses on the horizon here? There've got to be.
Well, I mean, yes, there's the Spider-Verse.
Oh, right. The Spider-Verse. I forgot about the Spider-Verse.
I still haven't seen Venom yet. I haven't been able to force myself to watch the whole thing. It looks really dumb.
Yeah.
My daughter's opinion of it is that it is really dumb, but it's still weirdly enjoyable.
Okay.
Yeah, not for me.
That's the way she described it.
The only thing weird about it to me was why I felt the need to go out and see it in the first place.
Because the verses work.
Yeah, you're
That's
right.
how they get you, right?
Well,
so I mean, we're getting all of the old Spider-Man in the next Spider-Man movie. They're clearly just making a live action Into the Spider-Verse.
yeah.
Which I can kind of live with. Although being a fan of a certain age, and I'm sure that you've experienced this too, the fact that we've lived long enough to have Spider-Man become a multiversal totem instead of just a dude from Forest Hills is definitely something weird. He's not the person I would have expected to introduce the multiverse concept to mass audiences. Mm-hmm. But I'm definitely seeing that movie as the second it comes out.
Oh, yeah.
I can't help myself. Tom Holland is fantastic. Tom Holland's my favorite Spider-Man. And even though I mostly hate the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, I'm still going to be 100% there for Alfred Molina coming back as a Dr. Octopus, even if it's just a cameo.
That's so interesting, because what I was about to ask you was, do you think the Spider-Verse will have that kind of foundation in the source material, like you're saying, which, was a real foundation there for stories to grow and circulate. And with a Spider-Man that I enjoy, but I do not recognize him as Spider-Man.
But both because he's now this multiversal thing, and because they made movie Iron Man into Spider-Man with alcohol problem. And then comic Spider-Man has kind of, I think, partially shifted in response to that too. Do you remember when comics Iron Man was a drip? Like 80s Iron Man was kind of tedious, right? He was kind of bland, tedious, and a little bit of an asshole. Mm-hmm. And now, Robert Downey Jr. played Tony Stark as rich Peter Parker, and then everything completely shifted about those characters, both on screen and in the comics. Because when did Slott open up Parker Industries in the comics?
Oh, when was that? I have to admit, I bailed on it at about that point.
That was like 2009, though, right?
Was it that recently? Yeah, well, it must have been, actually.
It might have been more recent. It might have been 2012, but that's still, like, Iron Man 1 was 2006, or was it 2008?
It was 2008, I think.
Yeah, so, I mean, you got Parker Industries and Horizon Industries and Superior Spider-Man. That happened around the same time that Iron Man became a cultural juggernaut for being rich Spider-Man. And then, so in the comics, they turn him into rich Spider-Man, and then they make him into a multiverse thing. Jeez. Yeah. I don't think I ever made that connection before.
I know there's a lot of X's and O's there,
Like, Charlie at the pinboard.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And back to your point, John, about not recognizing this Spider-Man as Spider-Man, I actually sort of think that Into the Spider-Verse kind of gives us, or gives any actor who plays Spider-Man from now into the future forever, the excuse that they need to be able to make Spider-Man into whatever they want it to be, because now you've got infinite spider people, right? Or pigs, as the case may be.
Or anime robots.
Right.
The teen girls who pilot them.
Yeah.
Yep.
The flashback to Assistant Editors Month. I remember. That's where Spider-Ham was its own thing. It wasn't Assistant Editors Month.
What was it? Yeah, it was Fred Hembeck. It was the Stan Soapbox, wasn't it? Was it those little Fred Hembeck cartoons in the Stan Soapbox where Spider-Ham first showed up? I
thought he just showed up in his own comic first, but I might be wrong. What do I know? It was a long time ago. I'm old, man. I'll tell you exactly when we reach peak saturation on the verses is when we get a Captain Carrot movie. Oh no, that's going to be the beginning of the next wave.
Again, a multiversity movie where one of the chapters of the story is Captain Carrot and the Zoo Crew, I'm there. I'm 100% there for it.
They pulled off Rocket Raccoon. Why not Captain Carrot over on the other side?
That is a shockingly valid point.
Anything's possible.
Literally anything is possible as long as they can make $750 million off of it.
Right.
So I have one question for you. I had a very interesting one of these conversations with Rich Johnston, in which we had a fundamental disagreement. And I wonder if you might be the tiebreaker here. He said something that I found very interesting when we were talking about sort of the nature of superheroes. And he said, superheroes are fundamentally right wing in that they are guardians of the status quo and enforcing the status quo. And I was like, I have never seen them that way. I see them as the power, responsibility, the helping people who don't have power and bringing them up and equalizing and I don't know. So you're the tiebreaker. I think I'm right.
I think you're right too. I don't think that you can make broad sweeping generalizations like that, period. I think if you look at the X-Men right now, Krakoa is a pansexual socialist utopia. There's no way around it. And like, you're definitely going to run into, like, part of the story is definitely going to be that breaking down. But like, you've got people who can't die anymore and people who can be resurrected as whatever they want. And they're still only just getting started exploring some of these themes, but it is, I think the underpinning of the Krakoa era of X-Men is actually fundamentally very left wing. I think that superheroes are just a collection of themed metaphors that can be applied to whatever we want. I think that if you want your superheroes to be fundamentally right wing, you can find a reading of that makes superheroes fundamentally right wing. You can look at the fact that Batman is a billionaire and read into that predatory capitalism works and that the great man theory is the only thing that's going to save us. Or you can look at the fact that, he's defined by his tragedy and he's in a not especially effective way building a social safety net for people. He's building it one at a time, and that safety net is being Robin. But, he's like, if you want to read it with a left-wing bent, you can read it with a left-wing bent. There are certain heroes where that's not possible. U.S. Agent was created as an explicitly right-wing hero, right?
But he's a commentary on right wing.
Yes,
so
right. He's actually kind of a villain, right? He's a critique of Reaganism. And so, but I think you can read it whatever way that you want, and you get different interpretations based on how the storyteller interprets that, right? Mark Millar very clearly believes that superheroes are fundamentally right wing, and it uses them to express his own fundamental right wing politics. Yeah. Alan Moore, I don't think, believes that superheroes are fundamentally right wing, or even if he does believe that superheroes are fundamentally right wing, uses the superhero metaphor as a critique of right wing politics. But I don't know. I'm trying to think of other good examples from current comics. Leanne, what do you think? Where did you fall on this?
Well, I think you're right that it's easy to read from any perspective, right? You can interpret most of these situations from whatever your initial perspective is. And I'm very, very, very left-wing. So I have always interpreted them from the left-wing perspective. These are people helping the little guy, which is a very fundamentally left perspective, right? That's everything that they do is helping the little guy. So for me, I have always interpreted them as left wing, and it was very interesting to hear about the perspective that they're right wing. I can understand, particularly for someone looking from a European perspective, how their concept of right wing is somewhat different from the U.S. perspective on right wing. So just anything that's authoritarian would be right wing from a European perspective. And, these characters typically are very authoritarian. I am the authority on how to do this right, on how to make things better. Whereas, here, right wing has some different connotations. It's not just authoritarianism that's, the representation of right-wing politics here.
Yeah.
So.
I think that, look, people keep coming back to Batman and Superman are your two explicit examples of kind of authoritarian politics in superhero comics. Superman is, for large chunks of his history, has been explicitly not right-wing. And Superman's whole thing is actually anti-authoritarianism, in that, like, if he wanted to take over the world, he could. No problem. If he thought he knew best and he thought his way was the only way, then he would be a tyrant. He doesn't take over the world because he's allowing people to find their own, he's allowing humans to find their own way, and he's helping out where he can. I think that Batman's existence as a legacy hero undercuts the argument that Batman is authoritarian. Yes, he's a billionaire. Yes, he personally, Bruce Wayne, has authoritarian tendencies. But I think that the fact that the Batman mantle is a thing that gets passed on and a thing that is able to be interpreted in so many different ways, textually, internally to the story, right? Whether Batman is Dick Grayson, whether Batman is old Damian Wayne, whether Batman is Terry McGinnis, or whether Batman is Barbara Gordon. I think that undercuts the idea that Batman is a fundamentally authoritarian concept, just because Batman can be so many different things.
I love this conversation. Do you want to come on some more? We'd love to make you a regular.
Yeah,
I would be happy to be a regular on this.
This would be awesome, actually. Yeah, we've got a couple friends who we've already, well, at least one other friend actually that we've warned, we're coming back for you. So then
I'm around.
We'll come back for you.
I'm glad to do it. Thanks for having me on. Oh. This has been a lot of fun.
That's it for this time around. Stop in next time and you will hear the conversation we alluded to, Jim, with Rich Johnston of Bleeding Cool. Our theme music is by Chris Piatek.